Who am I? A question that everyone has asked themselves at some point in life. What concerns me, excites me, interests me? As a child, I was thrilled when my parents bought me DVDs with movies and cartoons. The quality of the content on these discs varied greatly, but at the time, I didn't care much about the quality of the product. I was simply happy to immerse myself in new, captivating stories time and time again. Over time, DVDs became obsolete, and the internet took their place. But the memories of those days when every addition to our house movie collection was a small but significant event for me still linger somewhere deep in my mind. One of those memories recently decided to resurface unexpectedly. Scenes from a strange animated film about a lizard trying to survive in the Wild West. Unusual, somewhat grimy, occasionally eerie, surreal, and perhaps not entirely child-appropriate. A story about a hero named Rango. Initially, I thought rewatching Rango now would provide nothing more than a nostalgic injection, and that's it. Imagine my surprise when, instead of a quirky, amusing cartoon, I was met with a rather profound work. While watching, my mind was flooded with questions about various aspects of the story, and by the end, I had compiled quite the list. Though the film doesn't provide direct answers, there are plenty of hints and details scattered throughout. The main character is introduced meditating against the backdrop of a blue sky. Who is he? Before this question can settle, the protagonist begins putting on performances. So he's an actor, but in his theater, the only real actor is himself. A dead insect, a toy fish, the torso of a doll, and a plastic palm tree are hardly capable of playing their assigned roles. But what about the protagonist himself? The palm tree claims his character lacks depth, but surely a piece of plastic can make assertions. That's right. The remark isn't from the fake tree, but from the protagonist himself. Behind the boundless energy and a barrage of jokes lies a question that torments the hero's mind. Who am I? The oppressive realization of being unable to find purpose forces him to flee from the problem yet again, masking it with a simple and evasive question. I can be anyone? A captain, an anthropologist, someone else. But deep down, the protagonist knows this doesn't matter as long as his entire life is confined within the glass walls of a tiny aquarium. If only he could break that barrier. The familiar, pleasant, and comfortable space of the aquarium is replaced by the hostile and scorching environment of the desert. Traces of his past life evaporate along with the remaining water. From somewhere in the distance comes a voice crying for help. The protagonist meets an armadillo, unlucky enough to have been hit by a car. Despite his injuries, the creature somehow remains alive. He tells the protagonist he's on his way to the other side. The meaning of these words isn't entirely clear. Does he mean his imminent death, the literal crossing of the highway, or something else? After futile attempts to help his new acquaintance, the protagonist himself ends up in another car accident. Fortunately, luck is on his side, and he escapes serious injury. While recovering from the shock, the armadillo appears again, surprisingly intact. But how could a creature seemingly split in half heal completely in just moments? In truth, he didn't. He died while the protagonist was dodging cars. But who then is speaking to the lizard now? A ghost. A soul that has left the armadillo's body. In fact, it's possible he was dead all along. Throughout the film, the only one who interacts with the armadillo is the protagonist. The Wild West in this animation isn't just dangerous, but also mystical. The armadillo that meets the protagonist could very well be one of the prairie spirits appearing to the chameleon lost in unfamiliar territory. There's a trope called the spirit guide, a character who appears on the hero's journey to provide advice and act as a moral compass. In similar terms, they serve as a temporary guide and a partial mentor. A well-known example of such a character from films is Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars franchise. From video games, Johnny Silverhand from Cyberpunk might come to mind. Similarly, the armadillo in Rango offers hints and advice to the protagonist, points him in the right direction, and accompanies him when he needs it the most. This peculiar acquaintance indicates the direction to move to achieve his goals. The first undeniably living or albeit temporary character the protagonist encounters on his way to the town is a toad camouflaging itself as a rock to avoid being caught by a nearby hawk. Through its example, the amphibian helps the protagonist understand what he must do next: camouflage himself. Being a complete outsider in this world, the protagonist must blend in. After all, he's a chameleon, a lizard whose defining feature is the ability to change the color of its body. Even before entering the desert, the protagonist constantly transformed into various personas. Now, this experience will help him blend into this hostile world. Once in town, the protagonist begins to mimic the inhabitants one by one, but it's all in vain. He still stands out. So another idea comes to him: to create an entirely new persona based on everything he's seen. The protagonist invents a story about a hero who came from the far west, straight from beyond the horizon, from a dreadful and dangerous place. A hero born of the abyss itself. A hero named Rango. From now on, that is his name and his story. Most listeners believe his vivid tale of defeating the dangerous Jenkins brothers with a single bullet, but not the local bandits. They want to test if he's truly as good as he claims. A random turn of events leads Rango to kill the hawk with a single bullet. The townsfolk witness this, fully accept the protagonist as a hero, and Rango becomes the sheriff. This situation with the hawk's death, which instantly turned an outsider into a beloved hero, has a name: Accidental Hero. This plot device is often found in various works. The essence of it, as you might already understand, is that a particular character finds themselves in the right place at the right time. They don't perform any extraordinary actions, and in principle do nothing special, but circumstances align in such a way that their actions ultimately save the day. A great example of this trope is Stark's story from the anime Frieren, Beyond Journey's End. The villagers believed Stark historically stood in the way of a dragon, saving their village, but in reality, the young man was so terrified that he couldn't move. It's the same here. Rango didn't even aim at the hawk. The bullet simply ricocheted successfully. However, since it was the protagonist who fired the shot, the townsfolk declared him a hero. And you'd think everything had turned out perfectly. Rango is now sheriff, enjoys many privileges, and makes full use of his position. But why then do the owls continue to prophesy his death? Throughout the film, this feathered quartet accompanies Rango. For the viewer, they act as narrators of the protagonist's story. They exist both within the film's world, evidenced by their interactions with the protagonist, and outside it, as seen in their direct addresses to the audience. The presence of these characters takes us all the way back to ancient Greece, where the chorus was an essential part of theatrical performances. The chorus's main role was to comment on the unfolding events, conveying the author's intent, and express the audience's reaction to the work. Over time, this narrative element evolved and is now used less frequently in storytelling. But let's return to Rango. In this story, the owl quartet at first glance resembles a Greek chorus. However, they don't fully perform the function they are meant to according to their role in the narrative. They neither convey the author's intent nor express the audience's emotions about the story's events. Instead, the quartet repeatedly reminds us that, regardless of the protagonist's current circumstances, he's destined to face inevitable death. So who are the owls, if not a Greek chorus? They are the embodiment of the protagonist's fate. They symbolize the inevitability of his journey. They personify the path Rango is on. This is why the owls confidently state that no matter what stage of his adventure he currently is at, his actions will ultimately lead to his death. Rango quickly adapts to his role as sheriff. The new role comes to him quite easily. At first, he merely pretends to fulfill his duties, improvising, lying, and taking advantage of the privileges that come with his position. But over time, the protagonist genuinely begins to strive to help the town solve its problems. Of course, he doesn't fully manage to resolve the settlement's main issue, but he does achieve something remarkable. He manages to give the townsfolk something they had long forgotten: hope. As long as the sheriff's sign hung on the building, belief in the protagonist and hope for a better future remained in the hearts of the townsfolk. The town's mayor realized that Rango was getting too close to uncovering the truth and was about to disrupt his plans. This meant it was time for desperate measures. It was time to call in Rattlesnake Jake, the most dangerous outlaw of the desert. A terrifying rattlesnake armed with a Gatling gun that had been terrorizing the Wild West for a long time. During one of the times when Rango was spinning tall tales about his fictional life, he had the audacity, or perhaps the recklessness, to call himself Rattlesnake Jake's brother. Every decision has its consequences, and in Rango's story, the moment had finally come for the protagonist to face the consequences of his lies. Jake arrived in town ready to finally meet his brother, another legend, the hero who had supposedly killed 7 Jenkin brothers with a single bullet. Without further ado, the snake offers the protagonist a chance to take the shot and end everything here and now. For a legendary figure like Rango, this shouldn't be a problem. And of course, 1 bullet would be enough. But the truth is revealed. Rango is not the hero he pretended to be. All his heroic feats are just fiction, and he isn't even from the Wild West. The snake banishes the protagonist from the town, and Bobo asks Rango the question that started this entire story, a question that will remain unanswered. Who are you? Jake holds the status of a Wild West legend. People tremble at the mere mention of his name. Even the mayor's henchmen grew uneasy when ordered to summon Jake to the town. After all, the snake never left without claiming an innocent soul. The townsfolk compare him to death itself, which is quite fitting. The moment the snake showed up in town, he immediately killed Rango. Not literally, of course. He completely shattered and destroyed the hero's identity, the one meant to protect the town, reducing him to what he truly was, an isolated, nameless lizard. The protagonist had no choice but to admit defeat. The main character removes the sheriff's badge from his chest and leaves the town. His encounter with Jake destroyed Rango, shattered his legend, and forced him to return to where his story began, to the highway that once split the valley in two. But let's pause for a moment and go back to the beginning of the story. After the protagonist escaped the Hawk on his first night in the Wild West, he had a strange, surreal dream. Despite the seemingly nonsensical events in the dream, it carries meaning. The dream can be divided into 2 parts. The first is a foreshadowing of future events. The images of cacti turning into rattlesnake tails predict the protagonist's encounter with Jake. The animated cactus with a sinister face, on the other hand, highlights the protagonist's fear of the new and unknown environment he finds himself in. The second part of the dream reflects his first day in the Wild West and is a contemplation of his own life and the events he has witnessed so far. The Barbie doll part and the plastic fish are symbols of the protagonist's past life. The question posed by the fish reveals the protagonist's true thoughts. "Where are your friends, amigo?" He doesn't answer, not because the water prevents him from speaking, but because he genuinely has no answer. He realizes he has no friends, and that all his attempts to give inanimate objects personality traits and characteristics are simply a way to cope with loneliness. And so the protagonist returns to the beginning. His hands once again hold the plastic fish, emphasizing how alone he feels in this moment. He realizes he couldn't become the hero he wanted to be or meet the expectations of the townsfolk. So who is he really? No one, and he feels there's no reason to live anymore. With this mindset, the protagonist begins crossing the highway. Giant cars rush past him at incredible speeds, but nothing happens. The protagonist safely crosses the road and reaches the other side. A searing bright light floods everything around him. The main character regains consciousness and meets someone he had only heard about in legends, the Spirit of the West. Later, the armadillo says that on the other side, everyone sees what they are meant to see. And here it becomes clear why the spirit appeared to the protagonist in this specific form. The protagonist spent his entire life in an aquarium, as a pet of humans who often watched various films, including Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. Through the aquarium glass, the protagonist also watched them. This is where his fascination with acting was born, as the characters he portrayed were based on what he saw on television. And so the Spirit of the West also took the form of a character from one of his films the protagonist had seen. To the protagonist, he now acts as yet another guiding spirit, and he offers advice that the hero needs at this moment. It doesn't matter that he let the townsfolk down. What matters now is that they need help. It doesn't matter that he was pretending to be a hero. Now he must truly become one. Their conversation ends with the spirit's final words. "You can't escape your destiny." As he says this, he draws a rectangle on the glass of his cart. This is not the first time this geometric shape appears in the story. Of course, it has meaning. In the film Rango, rectangles symbolize self-discovery. The first time we see the protagonist create this shape is at the very beginning of the story, on the glass of his aquarium. At that moment, the rectangle only covers part of the character's face, signifying an incomplete or incorrect understanding of his self and purpose. The second time, the rectangle frames the protagonist's head entirely in the tilted mirror at the salon. In this moment, the hero decides to become someone greater than a nameless lizard. Yet he's still pretending, playing a role, and therefore still doesn't find the right answer to the question of who he is. But he moves one step closer to understanding himself. Finally, the third time, the protagonist is fully encompassed within the rectangle. This happens at the moment when the main character realizes who he truly is. The rectangles thus illustrate the hero's process to self-discovery. The window of understanding his purpose gradually expands, and as the protagonist progresses along his path, he gains a clearer sense of himself, until he finally answers the question that has plagued him his whole life. Now he understands that he's not just a lizard pretending to be a sheriff, but a real hero who must help those in need. The spirit of the West disappears, and the armadillo reappears before Rango. He explains that the valley was once full of water, and the protagonist decides to uncover what happened to it. He is guided to the answer by the cacti, which comes to life and march directly toward the mystery's resolution. Of course, the question arises, why do the cacti walk? If we consider that there's nothing mystical in the film, and that the other side and the encounter with the spirit of the West occur only in the protagonist's mind, then the cacti don't actually walk. This moment is simply a visualization of Rango's thought process. He follows a trail of dead plants stretching toward the water source and sees how the cacti guide him. We've seen something similar in BBC's Sherlock. There, the detective paused time, moved objects in the air, and saw words in front of him. But of course, it was only a visualization of his mental process. The same applies here. However, if we believe the Wild West in the film has a mystical nature, then the scene can be taken literally. Rango is still on the other side. It's a supernatural place where spirits dwell, and reality operates under rules different from our own. Correspondingly, cacti here are capable of what they can't do in the regular world. Whether the other side truly exists as a mystical zone in the story's world, or if all the events on the other side of the road happen only in the protagonist's mind, isn't that important? It doesn't really matter whether the encounter with the spirit of the West was a hallucination brought on by the harsh desert conditions, or if it was real, and the protagonist actually met the legendary figure. What matters is the result of their conversation. The protagonist finally understands who he is. He's not a lost, nameless pet, nor a pretender who accidentally became a sheriff. He's a real inhabitant of the Wild West, obligated to help those in need. Having developed a plan, the protagonist returns to the town. He enters the main street through the cemetery. This symbolizes his rebirth. He puts the badge back on his chest because he's still the sheriff, and the townsfolk still need him. A one-on-one duel. The snake versus the lizard. Crime against law. Rango is bad at shooting a gun, so his entire plan revolves around lulling Jake into a false sense of security. First the water, then the fake hawk, all to get close to his opponent, close enough to not miss. There's no room for error. The revolver only has one bullet. Jake's initial doubt that Rango could shoot him quickly turns into fear. The snake realizes that standing before him now isn't the cowardly liar with trembling hands, but a resolute hero with firm intentions. Jake understands that, in this moment, his life hangs by a thread. But the mayor uses his advantage, and Rango ends up captured. Even this doesn't stop the protagonist. The mayor is ultimately defeated. I mentioned earlier that the owls that constantly appear in the film symbolize the protagonist's fate. They also spoke of his imminent death, and they turned out to be right. During the first encounter between Rango and Jake, the latter symbolically kills the protagonist by completely destroying his story and fabricated identity. He kills the mythical gunslinger who supposedly killed all 7 Jenkin brothers with one shot, exposing him as a pathetic liar. But upon returning from the other side, the main character is reborn and shows everyone who he is, not through words, but through actions. By doing so, he demonstrates that fate can be taken into one's own hands and turned in the desired direction. Jake glares angrily at the defeated mayor. Then he looks at the bullet lying on the ground and finally understands who stands before him. His brother. Maybe not by blood, but certainly in spirit. The hero who became a legend in a single day. The hero who saved an entire town with a single bullet. The hero who, with just one shot, killed that cowardly liar right before everyone's eyes. The same liar Jake had previously exposed to the townfolk. A hero who, in the end, never actually hit the target with a single shot.